continent is a rich continent. Our riches are to be found in agriculture, our riches are to be found in minerals, our riches are to be found in human resources. Yet somehow the African continent continues to underperform. And this, in my view, is what legitimizes the conversation that we continue to have about the opportunities that are available to young people in the continent of Africa. We also do appreciate that Africa has the youngest population of all continents in the world. We also are aware that in critical areas such as technology, our contribution is minimal. And for that reason, every so often we have conversations such as these in order to ask ourselves what it is that we need to do going forward to ensure that we are not left behind. And because I've had the opportunity of listening to previous speakers, let me hazard some remarks. Many times when we have conversations around the continent of Africa, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in technology, in my view, we fail to identify some of the things that stand in our way, in our quest to achieve what we truly desire. When we talk about agriculture, for example, and agriculture is critical to all countries in the world. Right now, as you Nigerians know, there is a crisis of some of the food that you need. You are importing rice, you are importing poultry, and that is true of many African countries. Yet somehow, we who have had the advantage of education, and particularly Western education, which is the education that we are prisoners in the manner in which we live. When we talk about agriculture, we talk about fertilizer that we import from Russia or from Ukraine. The question that I want to ask today, when we talk about agriculture and about fertilizer, is it possible for us Africans to begin to look inward and to ask ourselves what it is that our research institutions are doing to ensure that the fertilizer that we produce is fertilizer that is beneficial to African soil? When we talk about seeds, we must ask ourselves, are those seeds propagated by our research institutions, or we are simply relying on seeds that are brought to us by Monsanto and indeed other organizations based in the West and progressively in China? I am suggesting to us that perhaps it is critical for many of us to unlearn some of the things that we have learned in order to engage with things that will help the commodity story. The other thing that we are inclined to do, particularly when we talk about technology, is to assume that the technology that we have is African technology. Even the medium that we are using now, if those who control Zoom were to decide to shut us out, we would go back to the dark ages. And if you look at all these technologies that we are deploying, you talk about artificial intelligence, Africa is a consumer of this. The question that I want to pose to this audience as we think about the future, what deliberate efforts are what deliberate efforts are we making to ensure that we are not just consumers? About 2 months ago, there was an outage of internet in western part of Africa because some cable had been cut in the Mediterranean Sea. And all of us who are present here can testify how helpless we were. It happened again in East Africa, and we were helpless. What are we doing beyond the mere consumption of technologies that are conceived and indeed produced from outside of the continent of Africa? If you follow trends, as indeed I believe you do, about 2 months ago you saw what the South Koreans were doing with their drones in Seoul, in South Korea. I've never seen anything like that in the continent of Africa. Somehow we are satisfied with consuming what others have produced. And I'm telling these organizations, the organizers and those who are present here, that until and unless we in the continent of Africa, with Nigeria providing we deliberately make effort to begin to do things that give us independence in the areas in which we are operating, we can be shut out anytime. And look even at the things that we are quick to cite as the things that will help Africa catapult herself into the orbit of sustainable development. I want you, as you sit in this assembly and as you listen to me, count 1 to 10 and tell me which one is produced in the continent of Africa. And I ask these questions because the development of other countries in the recent past has demonstrated that when you adopt technology from others, you've got to adapt it. Let me give an example. Which African country produces the mobile phone beyond assembly of it? None. We don't. We merely accept them. Which African countries are producing moving equipment that we use in construction of our roads beyond assembly of it? None. Which African country produces motorbikes beyond assembly of it? None. And I can go on and on. And I'm suggesting to those who are present here, and when we therefore are engaged in a conversation about the possibilities in Nigeria, those possibilities must be homegrown. And when we talk about homegrown, I'm not for one moment suggesting that we should shut ourselves up. I'm merely saying that when they are homegrown, they are sustainable because we understand them. Is what I'm saying anything new? No, nothing new. But we recognize that countries that are moving in a sustainable way have adopted the path of adoption of technologies and adoption of them. Look at China, which not more than 30 years ago was a backwater technological country. Look at what they produced in the area of mobile telephony, in the area of the media that they use for purposes of communication, WeChat, TikTok. We in Africa, we have nothing that we call our own. If we are not consuming TikTok, we are consuming WhatsApp. If we are not consuming WhatsApp, we are consuming Zoom. If we are not consuming Zoom, we are consuming LinkedIn. If we are not consuming LinkedIn, we are consuming something that is generated. And I'm suggesting to you without batting an eyelid, as long as we remain in that path, we shall continue, as you Nigerians say, flowing grammar without any movement in a sustainable direction. Look at South Korea. That is exactly what they did, whether it is in the area of agriculture, whether it is in the area of technology, whether it is in the area of mobile telephony, whether it is in the area of medical equipment engineering, whether it is in the area of artificial intelligence. All these countries, South Korea, now Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Turkey, have always built possibilities for their young men and women by having homegrown solutions. And without belaboring the point, I'm therefore saying that the conversation we are having today is a valid conversation. And the validity of this conversation is underpinned by recent developments in the continent of Africa. In fact, some of them are not very recent. As early as 1980 in Lagos, Nigeria, Africans met and raised critical questions under the Lagos Plan of Action. The Lagos Plan of Action is what, in my view, has now been translated into Africa Agenda 2063 and what is founded on the 7 pillars of Africa Agenda 2063, that we must make Africa prosperous. How are we going to make Africa prosperous? By having a human resource that is capable of harnessing the resources of the continent of Africa. That we are going to have an Africa that has technology as the driving force and our men and women as the people who will drive this process. An Africa that is free of conflict. An Africa that is strong and capable of organizing affairs and relating to the world. This Africa is going to emerge if Nigeria is strong. And why I keep on insisting on Nigeria's leadership is because Nigeria has a population that properly counted is in the neighborhood of 300 million. That is the resource. And if you look at Nigeria today, in whichever sector you are talking about, you find a Nigerian or Nigerians who are well trained, but how are we deploying those Nigerians? How are we using those Nigerians? How are we creating an enabling environment for those Nigerians? What kind of education are we talking about? I heard my good friend, the person, Mohammed Kinkin the Soya, talking about financing education. But what kind of education? This is a question that we don't ask. Because we may be paying for education that is not helping to produce the kind of labor that we deserve. If you are all better, if you are supposed to stand, people don't teach me nonsense. Is it possible that in the continent of Africa, we are teaching our young men and women the kind of things that they ought not to be taught, and that therefore we ought to think about education rather than simply certifying people out of universities, most of which are glorified high schools, and then they become unemployed? These are painful questions to raise, with painful answers. Yet the beauty of an engagement such as this is that it gives us an opportunity to ask these questions and to get practical answers for them. And that is why, as I conclude, I want us to ask ourselves, going forward, what are we going to do to ensure that we use the most important resource, the human resource? What environment are we going to create to enable them to thrive? What linkages are we going to create to ensure that our continent, through the leadership of Nigeria, is a continent that will enable our young men and women to thrive? It can be done, and it must be done, because that is what Africa demands of us. And I have no doubt in my mind that after these engagements and after listening to the contributions that have been made and listening to some of the most painful questions that are being posed, we will have a productive engagement, and that the results of this engagement will find place in the minds and hearts of policymakers, that they may be translated into some action. Thank you very much for listening to me making those very good remarks. Thank you.
Can we please put our hands together one more time for the one and only Professor Lumumba, all the way from Kenya. Always a pleasure to listen.